Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this mini version of Thriller Fest. It's always fun to talk to Don Bentley, who's taken over the Tom Clancy series. And I'm telling you, this is a really fabulous book. Not only that, you get to learn a lot of stuff about North Korea that would never have occurred to you. So super fun. And we get to meet Mike Woodward and his debut, The Handler, which is also a wonderful book. And it takes us to Iran, which is, again, not the normal theater for thrillers of the moment. So thanks, guys, for doing something different. I'm really kind of like tired of the basic Middle East sandbox or, whatever. So I really appreciated the change of venue. Both of these authors have really interesting backgrounds, and in an age when there's a huge amount of pressure to be authentic. In other words, you have to be the right race or the right gender or the right culture or something to write about anything anymore, which I consider to be totally tiresome because after all, it's fiction and you're making stuff up. But nonetheless, both Don and Mike have really interesting personal backgrounds that they bring to their fiction. So first, guys, a toast to you.
Toast. Thanks for having us, Barbara.
It's really
thank you, Barbara.
So let's see, Don is authentic sniper and other stuff. And one of the things about Tom Clancy Zero Hour is there are plenty of opportunities for operations and snipers and all. So Don, give us a little bio for people who haven't met you before. And then Mike, I think, is a retired intelligence officer. And so he can kind of tell us why his guy has to go back to Iran, which I consider to be emotional blackmail.
Well, thank you for that, Barbara. Yeah, I spent 10 years as a Army Apache helicopter pilot and also a couple years as an FBI special agent and SWAT team guy. And what was so fun about writing Zero Hour is my first assignment out of flight school was actually Korea. And so there's a really fun subplot in Zero Hour that has a new Army Apache pilot getting to his first duty assignment in Korea right as the war breaks out. And so you get to see that. And I took all the guys I flew with in Korea and made them characters, including the main one. So it was super fun. Today on Facebook, one of the guys I flew with, his grown daughter found the book and then found her dad's name in it and circled it and stuff. So it's been really, really fun. And it was a super interesting book to write.
Well, it really rocks along. Now, I have to admit that, it's only because I have spent 32, coming up to 33 in October, years at the Poison Pen, that I read military fiction because, I basically started out with, romance and fairy tales and the Oz books and all. But gradually, I have, because our rule is that we read the books, all the books that we do events for, I have read the books, or Patrick, or Karen, or Larry, whichever one of us is doing the event. So as a consequence, I have read an enormous amount of international thrillers and military fiction, which I might not have gravitated to. But I have to say that this one actually, I read it all in one gulp, Don. Knowing
Wow.
I can do that. But I'm telling you, the action never stops in this book. And I loved the Russian woman. We'll talk about her. And I really like the fact that you gave Jack Ryan Jr. such physicality, such a portrait. Were you at all influenced by, the Jack Ryan film stuff? Because your descriptions of him are kind of like the guy that's playing Jack Ryan on television.
It's interesting you say that. I think he is, for my money, I think Alec Baldwin was the best Jack Ryan. And then John Krasinski is pretty close to right up there with him. And he is so good that when it's confusing, as you know, but maybe some of the people listening don't, in the book world, the guy that John Krasinski plays in the Amazon series, Jack Ryan Sr., is in his probably 60s or early 70s or so, and is president of the United States. And so when I tell people about my books, the Jack Ryan Jr. ones, I'm like, imagine John Krasinski, like imagine him as my character, because that flows more, and the character I write and the stories I write more closely tie in probably to the Amazon series than the series that Mark Cameron writes, just because it's so different. So it's interesting you say that, because that he also really resonates with me as a Jack Ryan character. I think he's fantastic.
Well, he is, but as I said, he was recognizable. I especially like the fact you talk about how these guys have to have broad backs and whatever. And so it's
Yeah.
hard for them to be hidden in a crowd because,
Yeah.
they don't blend in all that well because they have
Yep.
this
Yep.
extra physical presence. I thought that was really well done.
Thank you. And that's absolutely true. There was one of when I before I started writing full time, my last job, we made a uniforms that matched your thermal and visual signature, and so we had a lot of interesting customers. And sometimes they would try and do exercises in civilian clothes, right? Because if they're working in China or they're working in a country overseas, low visibility, that's what they're going to be wearing. And it's hard for those guys to blend in because not only are they, and Brad Thor, I think, put it the best, not only are they built well and everything, but they're hyper vigilant, and they almost have to dial that down a little bit because it becomes noticeable that this hyper vigilant person is in the room, and you can kind of, even just a normal person like you or me would say there's something different about that guy. He's watching the crowd too, or he's too keyed in or something. So they really do have a presence, and I tried to capture that both with Jack Ryan Jr. and then the other folks in the book for sure.
I wonder if adrenaline has a pheromone. May have an interesting scent signature all of its own. We can explore that. So Mike, tell us about you.
Well, yeah, first, just as kind of a segue, Don had a post a couple days ago, and I may get this wrong, Don, but it was something along the lines of, who would have thought that the 14-year-old that loved Red Storm Rising would be writing the Tom Clancy books today? And I found that super inspiring. Back then, I'm a few years older than Don, but back then, right around the time Hunt for Red October was becoming a big deal, I was kind of a midshipman cadet getting ready for a naval career. That led me into intelligence, and then the naval intelligence career, I did that for about 10 years, and it got me very close to things that I don't think I otherwise would have in another discipline. In other words, I was often kind of tapped to be a liaison with foreign militaries. I was often kind of along for the ride or advising other warfighters, whether they're submariners or pilots or commandos, et cetera. So it gave me a really broad, kind of high level view, which for somebody who wanted to write, that was super valuable. And at some point I ended up on the staff of the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Command. And that's a joint command. So you get to meet all these different military folks. But then I left and ended up in Amazon and was very close to Prime Video, where one of the things I worked on was Tom Clancy Jack Ryan with John Krasinski.
Nice.
So yeah, and what helped out the showrunners there. So all that came together for me, and that's what led to this book.
I find it so interesting that, I can sort of understand how reporters and lawyers, nurture a secret yen to write novels and all the rest of it. I still remember when I asked Jack Carr, what, you're a Navy SEAL, you could kill me with one finger. Why are you writing novels? My mother's a librarian, he said. I always wanted to write. And I thought, okay, there are hidden stories in the background of you guys who've been trained to do some really, dangerous physical stuff, but somehow or other, those of you who write, I think for the most part, always wanted to write. It isn't like you retired and then you said, well, this is so boring, maybe I'll just write a book. Would that be fair for you, Mike? Is that
absolutely fair? In fact, I tried probably twice while I was a naval officer, and I think one thing, it's the rare talent I think that can write a book as a really, really young person, because I think you need enough life experience to really populate your characters with all the kind of emotional dramas that you yourself have eventually experienced. In my book, the hero and heroine are a divorced couple, and I wanted to kind of feature, or what I wanted to be a major theme of the book, for example, was that bond of trust and the idea that, hey, even though they're divorced, they've had a child together. It's something that just can't be broken, despite these dangerous situations they find themselves in. And having been married for 28 years, that felt like something that I wanted to say to the world in my writing. And I think when I was 26 or 27 and wanted to write books like this while I was still in the Navy, I don't think I had that life experience, even though I was close to the operations.
Well, no, you wouldn't have had that life experience. You just have to get older in order to have.
And that happened somehow. Yeah.
Yep, to have that history. So, when pairing you together, it occurs to me, that, the kind of, I mean, the basic idea, the basic or international intrigue or whatever probably isn't that different. But do intelligence officers and, serving military guys, wouldn't you go about it differently? Does that sort of, what we're coming up to is every summer I do a Spies of Summer thing, because there's so many books like this that come out in June and July. I mean, we've got you guys, I've got Dan Fesperman and Joe Cannon with him, and Brad Thor and Daniel Silva, all in July. I mean, it's just like this big clump. And then, you all in June. So I think obviously publishers are publishing for summer reading. They want it to go well. But if I were a reader, which way would I want to go with a spy story or intelligence work versus high op military action? Mike, what do you see as the difference?
I think the genre has kind of changed. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was about techno thrillers and that kind of authenticity, and really introducing readers to this military operational stuff that they hadn't seen before. And I really think that caught fire. Up to that point, the spy thrillers had been sort of less action, less punches being thrown, and more cerebral. I think as the Cold War ended and 9/11 happened, the genre really changed to a lot of, knife fights and gunfights and terrorism and those kinds of things. I think we're switching back now to where there is this intersection between espionage, because we're having great power competition with China and Russia right now, for example, and that's renewed. So I think there's this renewed interest in espionage and kind of more cerebral level around deception and trickery and trust and all those kinds of things. But again, the genre had shifted to show a lot of action. So I think the key at this point is to try to intertwine those two things and combine those two things. And one last thing I'd say is streaming media, I think, really changed the expectation of the reader. And 20 years ago, you would read a book for a book's sake, and it might be 800 pages, and you were happy it was 800 pages because you wanted it to last a month. Now I think people have gotten so in tune with streaming media and a beginning, a middle, and an end that they expect a novel to kind of work the same way. And so you'll notice the page counts are all kind of similar. So those are the trends that I'm seeing happening.
I think, I've explored that question. Of course, we're the Outlander bookstore, so Diana's books are a complete anomaly because, we can hardly even lift them. We often say that you can either join a gym or work at the Poison Pen. It's either way, so all that going on. But I think you're right in terms that streaming television has definitely changed readers' expectations. It's also been marvelous for authors in that, books that never would have successfully made it to the big screen or might have had like a one-shot movie. I mean, look at the difference between Michael Connelly's The Lincoln Lawyer with Matthew McConaughey, for example, and then now it's streaming television, which I have to say I thought was really well done. And, to try to do it all in 2 hours as opposed to whatever it was, 10 episodes, makes a big difference. I really like that. But in the 19th century, Afghanistan, I even hate to mention the word, but that was known as the Great Game, right? The British called it, and their military ops and their spy ops and all the rest of it around that part, India, and it was all known as the Great Game. And Le Carre wrote kind of in that tradition and whatever. And now where's the Great Game? It's in Don's case, it's in North Korea, because boy, there's a real game that you set up there. We're looking at China and Taiwan coming up. We're looking at, we've seen the horrors that are going on in Russia. And so we're back to great games, but more of them in more theaters. I'm a child of the Cold War, and I feel like I've fallen right back into it.
I think we're in a new age of imperialism. And while I don't think that's good for us geopolitically, and it's a more dangerous world. For thriller writers, there's certainly there's an abundancy of geopolitical plots and material.
Absolutely, and locations, which is what we started out talking about here. Sorry, Don, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, when you were talking about that, Barbara, what it reminded me of, so when like Clancy and Larry Bond and Harold Coyle and Dale Brown and all of those folks who kind of formed that genre, it really was still that epic military thriller. And then for me, it was people like Brad Thor and Vince Flynn who took that and brought it down to the operator level. And so it certainly wasn't spycraft so in the British tradition, but it was different. It shifted away from that epic military thriller. And now I think like Mark Greaney and Rip, they broke that right back open with Red Metal. They had that huge epic military thriller that was successful again. And so I think maybe it gives us, I think it's both changing of the times, like you said, and then people like Rip and Mark writing that book gives all of us maybe permission to flex in that direction again, right? And say, okay, we've had a lot of people who were not clones of Mitch Rapp or Scott Harvath, but people who wrote in a very similar manner. Because when you're dealing with the terrorism threat, it's a very surgical, it kind of reflects that kind of protagonist. Now we're going back to what, frankly, like we said, what we thought was behind us. We thought the Cold War was done. We thought great power struggles were done. And now it doesn't look like that's the case anymore. And so as novelists, I think we have to follow that trend and adapt.
Indeed. So, Mike, you mentioned that you have a married couple here. John Dale, you decided to give him kind of a rough backstory that happens before he's drawn back into the action by his ex-wife, who is still actively deployed. So, what's John's story?
John's story is that he was one of the operatives that Don was just talking about. Really kind of active in counterterror operations in ISIS and the Middle East. And I really wanted to showcase the realism and the heroes of real world people that do things like that in CIA operations in places like Syria and Iraq, allied with the Kurds, et cetera. And so I wanted John Dale to reflect that realism, but I also wanted him to be damaged. And so he is damaged. He survived something at the hands of ISIS and had started questioning the tactics of the people he was working for, thinking they were perhaps a little too brutal or a little bit too self-serving for certain people's careers. And so he left in a snit. And he's a guy that honor is very important to him. He doesn't necessarily march to the beat of the drum of a large bureaucracy. And so he bailed. And that actually ended up destroying his marriage, because his wife is kind of in the other direction, a believer in following the rules and being part of the bureaucracy. So what they have in common is the duty and the mission and the honor, but what they don't have in common is the way to go about that. And that ends up being a rift in their marriage.
So do you think it would be fair to say that in military thrillers, you talk about this a lot in your book, Don, that you've got guys loyal to each other, they have each other's backs. I mean, that's a theme that goes on in the book. And even the Russian woman, who I think is fascinating, even if she's loyal to Russia, she still wants to have the back or to protect, her friend. But in intelligence novels, isn't a huge question all the time about who you can trust? Who's loyal? Does anybody have your back, or is everybody out to betray you? And maybe that's another defining characteristic.
That's really good, Barbara. I'd never put that together before. You should do this for a living. It is, but that's a great distinction between the two. I honestly never thought about it that way, because the old quip is that when you're sitting in a foxhole, you're not fighting for your country anymore. You're fighting for the guy that's in the foxhole with you, or the guy or girl with you. And so that sense of brotherhood, that sense of when you go through, and that's something I try and show in my series too, where you have two people who have gone through combat together, and that it acts as a forge and makes a relationship that's different than any other. There's a verse in the Old Testament where Jonathan and David, they talk about the two of them, that they love each other closer than a brother. And that's what I always feel like, what it's like going through combat with somebody. But on the other hand, like you said, that's such a great distinction most of the time in the intelligence, because when I was in the FBI, we referred to our CIA brethren as professional liars, because that's the job of a case officer, right? Is to go out and to convince somebody to work for you. And by nature, you're asking them to betray something, to betray their country,
Exactly.
to betray their family, to betray their friends. And so it's a business that's built on betrayal. And so as much as you want to pretend otherwise, oftentimes that, can seep into the organization as well, where some of the greatest novels in that genre come back to who do you trust? Who do you trust? And so I think that's a great distinction. In the military, what you see oftentimes is, and Tom Clancy did so well in Red Storm Rising, is it humanizes the people who are fighting on the other side of the battlefield for you, right? Because if you were born in a different country, you could very well be them. You just happen to be American, they happen to be Russian. And so you get to see it humanize it. I think for good intelligence thrillers like what Mike has done, what you get is more that question of who can you trust, of what is actually real, who are the people that are around you who have your back, and who are the ones who are trying to betray you. I think that's an excellent way to look at it.
I also think, there's a more guilt that comes up in the sense that in your book, Mike, what they do results in the death of somebody, somebody they're trying to get to betray, their country, the Iranian. And, you feel guilty about it. If you have two guys side by side in a foxhole, you have that great scene at the end, where they're piled on each other in the foxhole, praying that they can somehow or other hold off, the North Koreans until the helicopter gets there. If somebody dies, there doesn't have to be guilt involved. Whereas in Mike's book, I think, that if you end up being responsible for that person that you were turning, so to speak. Do you think that, that's another difference? Because I thought guilt was a fairly powerful emotion in your book, Mike.
I was that theme of who can you trust is something I was really trying to explore, because there is a trust relationship for people putting their lives at risk between the asset or agent who's a foreigner and the case officer who's the handler, right? And that's a scary trust bond if you think about it, because they're constrained in their ability to communicate. They almost have mutually assured destruction, and that if one doesn't live up to their end of the bargain, they can put the other person in a great deal of jeopardy. And so that's kind of what set my book up, is that you had an asset that said, I don't trust you guys to do what you always said you were going to do. So I'm now going to withhold information. And the only guy I trust is this one guy. Well, that sets off a chain of distrust, because that guy doesn't trust the CIA anymore. He does, however, trust his ex-wife, who by design and the nature of their relationship have trust issues. And so that was something that I was trying to hit on quite a bit. And I think as a novelist, it's all about character development and trying to put these folks into conflict and to question things and to question loyalties and to question morality and so that it's a little bit unpredictable about what they would do. And certainly all those human emotions like guilt would play a part in that.
So if you have a handler, go ahead, Don.
No, I was going to say, I wanted to jump in there real quick, because I think Mike did such a great job with that. When I was an FBI agent, one of my jobs was to run and recruit sources. And so I've been a handler before. And so it's this strange dynamic where you're developing this sense of trust with someone that you are in turn going to go to ask to do something that's probably detrimental to their health, right? Whether it's, hey, I need information on this drug gang, I need information. And so you're bonding with them on a human level at the same time, knowing that you're going to have to ask them to do something. And then the scenario Mike played out is also very common, that you and I might bond as handler and source, or handler and asset, but eventually I'm going to try and pass you off to somebody else. And you're going to have to work, even though we've spent all of this time developing what looks like a friendship, it's not. And you're going to want to, and sometimes that works. And sometimes exactly what happened in Mike's book, where the asset or the source says, no, this is the only person I'm going to work with because that's who I trust. And then you get in that dynamic of who's handling who is actually the handler that's tasking it. And Mike just did that so well in this book.
He absolutely did. But it seems to me that a basic skill involved here as a handler is you have to figure out what will motivate somebody to do what you want them to do. And there's a whole range of things. I mean, there's the obvious, like those two idiots, that were trying to sell Navy secrets for, strictly for cash.
Mhm.
Okay. I mean, it was all transactional, just about money. And, but then there are all kinds of other motivations. They can be ideological, as, financial, emotional. It
Yep.
can be, in the James Bond thing, which kind of, a lot of times it was just like love interest or sex or whatever it might be. So does an experienced handler, Mike, have to try, well, both of you have done it, have to try to sort out what what will motivate somebody to betray whatever betrayal you have in mind?
Oh, no question. And I think that's where that brings in that question of morality, and where someone who certainly is going to have a code of ethics is going to question what they're doing, because their job is to do whatever it takes to manipulate that person into, affecting the mission for their larger organization, in this case, the CIA. And how they go about and get that done, they can get fairly creative, but results really matter. I mean, in this business, results matter. They're everything, right? And so you can see, if you're if you're a case officer out on a very long tether, and it's very important that you're successful, not just for you, but for effectively the world, then you're going to employ whatever tactic is necessary. And you might not sleep well at night knowing that you've done that, right? You might manipulate things in such a way that bothers you. So I think the good ones find areas where they wouldn't be troubled, right? There are sort of common bonds and themes between that asset and that case officer, but I think it's inevitable that those are going to get strained and tactics are going to get a little tricky.
So now that I've asked you all these penetrating questions, why don't we, why don't you each set up your book for us, as, do your little elevator pitch thing and then talk to each other. So Don, you want to go first?
Sure. And this is the most terrifying question any writer can answer, is what is your book is actually about? So my book takes, like I said, it takes place on the Korean Peninsula. And what happens, so this is like all good thriller writers. I've got this file full of research of things that are interesting to me. And so a number of years ago, there was a Russian cruise missile test that went awry, and the NATO, I guess, code word for it, or the US code word for it, was Skyfall. And this cruise missile was a nuclear powered cruise missile that would in theory have infinite range. And when the Russians launched it, there was some kind of malfunction and it went into the ocean. The Russians, doing as Russians do, tried to hide it from the rest of the world. And as they were recovering from this missile, or recovering it from the ocean, the reactor went supercritical, and the explosion was so big it registered on the Richter scale as an earthquake. And so all of this crazy, so I grabbed that. I'm like, I have to use that. I don't know where, but sometime I'm going to use it. And so the way I use it is I have the book starting off with the Russians deciding to test that same missile in North Korea, and the North Korean dictator being in attendance and being incapacitated during that missile going supercritical and causing injury. And that sets off kind of a cascade of events, one of which being kind of a dead man switch, where there are a number of sleeper agents who are in South Korea who get activated by his incapacitation. And the second being a struggle to fill the power vacuum that's left by him being disabled. And so Jack Ryan Jr. is in South Korea meeting with a potential campus handler as everything kicks off, and you get to see kind of the opening stages of what a conventional war on the Korean Peninsula would look like as a result.
Well, yeah, and there is a coup in the making, as you say. And I love the way that you wrote about your description of the North Koreans. I thought was really very good. The basic psychopath, in charge, and whether the people underneath him would be freed from fear, or whether one of them would just take their place, because I don't see that the Russians have really benefited from losing Stalin. Now they have Putin. So it seems to me in these kinds of countries, you lose one guy, but it doesn't really help you. All right. So Mike, what about your book?
You do, and
Go
Oh,
on.
Don, go ahead, please. Don, go ahead.
Oh no, the only thing I was going to say is that it's really hard to be a dictator because there's no retirement plan for that. So you either manage to hang out on the power as long as you can, or you go out kind of like Gaddafi did or somebody like that. So go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, you go out feet first. My let me start with a real world event. On January 8th, 2020, a civilian airliner, it happened to be Ukrainian, took off from Tehran, and it was filled with regular old civilians, a lot of whom happened to be Iranian college kids going back to school in Canada. And right after liftoff, it's just they're headed back to school because it's kind of the new year. It's January 8th. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Air Defense mistook it for a U.S. Tomahawk missile and shot it down and killed everybody on board. Real world event. And when that happened 2 years ago, that really struck me, maybe because I'm a father with college age kids. And I started thinking about the potentialities of what that would be like for the victims' families. And so that kind of inspired the plot. So in the plot, one of the victims' families is a U.S. asset. It's a kind of late middle-aged nuclear scientist who's been in uranium enrichment in Iran for quite some time. And he's been getting code from the US to effectively sabotage their centrifuge arrays. So when this happens to his daughter, it kind of has him reevaluate his life and his purpose, and he wants out. He wants to salvage what's left of his family. Similar to what we were talking about earlier with trust, he really only trusts one guy to bring him out, the person that put him in place about 7 or 8 years earlier. And that's a guy that is now out of the CIA. So to get that guy back into the CIA, they have to rely on this female senior CIA officer who has kind of moved into the management ranks, but she has a relationship with that excommunicated CIA officer, and that she's his ex-wife. So her first job is to recruit him back into the service, and then together they need to get this agent either out of there so the Iranians never knew he was really there and he can help them from the US, or kill him or get him back in place. So manipulate him one way or the other. And that's really the summary of the plot.
So go ahead, Barbara. I'm sorry.
No,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's chilling to regard another human being as an asset in that way. It really kind of dehumanizes him. First, you have to figure out what will motivate him in order to help you. But then, basically he just becomes the pawn in the game.
He does. And for me, what I definitely wanted to kind of show was to try to humanize everybody, whether they were an antagonist or a protagonist. So I wanted this man suffering because he's lost his daughter. His wife suffers from multiple sclerosis. And one of the things he's doing is he's getting medicine from the CIA. So he's somewhat dependent on the CIA. And he's also a secret ideologue. He's not somebody that supports the mullahs that are in charge of Iran. He considers himself a Persian, and they have a proud liberal tradition, and he sees himself as an academic as part of that, but he's had enough. So that's exploring his motivations was something that was kind of fun for me.
So I love this book, and we were talking before we came on. Mike and I share the same editor, and Tom Colgan, and so it was the weekend before my book was due. It was due on a Sunday, and it was like a Thursday, and I get a text from Tom Colgan, and he's like, "I need you to read this book. You got to read it. I've got room for one more blurb." And I'm like, "I literally have a book due in 3 days." And he's like, "Just take a look at it." And then I read the whole book and missed my deadline for my book. And so one of the things that I loved about this, and you've kind of hit on it a little bit, is you tell the story from two different perspectives. You almost have two protagonists. And that's a really gutsy thing to do, because if you do it wrong, what you end up doing is just diluting the story because maybe the reader likes one or not the other or something. So talk a little bit about John and Meredith and why you decided to tell the story from both of their points of view.
Yeah, sure. And I guess for anybody watching, if you're curious, I'm new at this. Don is a seasoned pro, and so so when Tom Colgan said to me, "Oh, Don Bentley did a blurb for you," and it was a fantastic blurb, and I was so honored and surprised, and found them on LinkedIn and said thanks, and of course Don, being the guy he is, gives me his cell phone, and I'm like dealing with this new world, and so Don has really helped me kind of understand how to manage a lot of this, and that sort of mentorship has been super valuable to me. So that's the kind of guy that you're dealing with here. But as to the question, Don, I wanted to, I guess I wanted to explore two things. One is I wanted the hero of the story to be their relationship and to be the unbreakable bond of marriage. And I thought by having them divorced, that made it even more interesting, because it showed that it wasn't about an institution or a piece of paper or anything like that, but it was really about a human bond and a human connection. So I wanted that to be the central thing. And I wanted that to show that's who you can really trust. At the end of the day, it's the people like that in your life that you can trust. Everything else in that world of espionage is sort of manipulation, mistrust, questioning. Who can you trust? So that was one reason I wanted to do it that way. The other is I really wanted the character, the heroine, to be a woman. I wanted to be a strong woman, partly because I've worked with so many, and I met, my wife was also in the military, and she was a helicopter pilot, a Naval Academy graduate, and so I've spent 28 years with her, seeing kind of her reactions to men and male dominated organizations and everything else, and have also found it entertaining and amusing. So I wanted to bring some of that to life in my main character.
So Mike, what did you like about Don's
you
book?
did really get.
I'm sorry, I stepped in there, Don. Carry on.
No. I was just gonna to add one more point to that, is that every spy novelist starts with the trope, and you have to do it, but because readers expect it, but you have to try and find a new way of, how do I convince the reluctant hero to come back in from the cold? And having your ex-wife call you up and ask you to save the world is a very good one, Mike. I've never seen that one before. So kudos to that. But I think part of the other thing that you do really, really well is, even though you say their marriage is the unshakable bond, Meredith, the wife, has to be a handler. And so there are times where she has to think like an agency case officer and not a wife or even an ex-wife when it comes to the man that she's putting into harm's way. And you also show it from his perspective, where he's trying to think, is this my wife now? Is it just another agency employee? Can I still trust? So talk a little bit about that, because I feel like you did an exceptional job there.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And that I wanted to show the challenge. One of the things that led to their divorce were their differing perspectives on how to handle the job. One guy is on the ground and is more of a guy that kicks indoors and is sort of a black and white A to B kind of person. And so he effectively rarely trusts anybody above him. Whereas she is someone who's kind of more experienced in the bureaucratic arts and the ability to survive, political rumbles and those kinds of things. So I wanted that to be a symbiotic relationship, which I think a lot of marriages are kind of a good, even though these guys are divorced. I think a lot of marriages are a good symbiotic relationship. So I wanted them to be that yin and yang of that. And there was, I'm new at this. I'm a rookie, right? This is debut novel, but I found that an effective way to see how somebody else, to really define a character was to do it through another character's eyes. And so that's what I was always trying to do, was trying to explain John almost by the way Meredith was thinking about him, and vice versa. So that was the idea. And now I guess I get to ask a question, Don. So Don, I think one of the things that I found tricky, and you have a lot of experience at this, is you want real world events are often the inspiration, but then you take it in a completely fictional direction by design. So talk a little bit about how you relate back the real world, how you bring that into fiction. And then one thing I always think about is, I mean, you recently had a book about Ukraine. How do you how do you deal with, or how do you plan for that the world changes, or do you just not? Do you just cut it off at a certain point? But talk about that interplay a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting you bring that up, because that was one of the things I wanted to talk about with you, is that there are several things. You mentioned the shoot down that happened. You also referred to Soleimani's death and stuff like that. And so you really walk that line of two interchanging worlds. For me, for Zero Hour, I had to, because it's a Clancy book, I had to go back and look at how the other writers, how Mike Madden had treated North Korea and who he had. And because I really wanted to be able to show the craziness that is North Korea and what both, it's this very unique environment, because you have the kind of the Stalin-esque model of a dictator, but then it's also this crazy hereditary thing that goes along with it, where they've passed it from, grandfather to son to son again now, and potentially maybe daughter or something. So I wanted to pull all of that in and to show as much as I could on it. But I always defer the story I tell a lot is in my first book, my debut Without Sanction of the Matt Drake series. There's a scene in there where Matt does this hey-ho jump. And so I have a very good friend of mine that's a sergeant major, spent most of his career in the Delta Force. And so I had him go through that scene over and over again to make sure I had all the technical details right. And after he got done reading it, he said, we would never just send one guy, right? And I said, yeah, I know that. And I said, but was it a good story? And he said, it was a great story. And I'm like, well, that's what I'm going to do. And so that's kind of the thing where I do is I try and keep enough reality in it so that the reader says, okay, I see where this is going, or yes, I've heard about that event. I buy that. But then to remember at the end of the day that this isn't nonfiction, that we're here to tell a story, and to tell a good story, you've got to take some liberties. And I think that the more stuff you get right that you can get right, then the reader starts to give you the leeway to go tell that great story and fudge some things on the other side. When I was talking with Brad Taylor about it a different time, he's like, Matt Drake moves across the world a whole lot faster than we ever did. And I said, yeah, that's because I get bored writing those in between scenes. So I just hit them one after another. And so that's kind of where I did it, where you have a lot of touch points in yours that are, based on, you talk about the Stunek virus, all of those. And so how did you make that decision on what you were going to give the nod to say this really happened versus the parts where you were going to diverge and tell a story?
Being a rookie, I don't know if I was as intentional about it, but I think I tried. I almost think of it as like they were just guideposts or moorings or something like that would tether a fictional story to the real world enough that people would go, okay, got it. And somebody asked me the other day, like, well, what's the difference between a good what you read in the news and fiction? And I said, well, I think the job of fiction is you're showing the story behind the story, and so you're dramatizing people that you would never read about. That's what I think we all try to do that, right? Like now Jack Ryan's a little different, right? They're all in the hallowed halls of government at that point. But like in the Matt Drake series, like these are guys that you're never going to know their names, And so I wanted to kind of celebrate those people. And so I think that's how I thought about it, was if you showed readers, these were the real world events, but this is the stuff that could have happened in the background by these guys, then it seems more plausible.
That's good.
And hey, if I could ask a follow-up question, so like you talk about taking artistic and fictional liberties in like a Matt Drake, right? Because he's all yours. Can you talk a little bit about what it means, like how you approached the entire the entire Tom Clancy assignment? Like, how do you fit into other people's shoes? Like, what was that like?
So I'll say the first thing that really helped is Tom Colgan told me early on. So we were talking earlier, Barbara brought it up about how streaming television has affected viewers' expectation. And I think the same thing is the novels now. Like if you look, and again, I go back to, I think Brad Thor and Vince Flynn and Kyle Mills were the ones that kind of shifted away. If you read the Clancy books now, they're still fantastic, but the pacing is much, much slower than what readers have for an expectation now. And so what Tom Colgan told me, our editor, he said, hey, I don't want you to try and be Tom Clancy. He's like, nobody can. He's like, I just want you to do what you do, but do it in his universe. And he said, tell your kind of story with his characters. And so that took some of the pressure off. I think the other thing I did though is go back and read some of my favorite Clancy books to say, what was it when I was, 14 or 15 or whatever, what was it that I loved about his books that so captivated me, and how can I bring some of that in or give nods to it in the series and really pay tribute to the work that he did. And then I think the last part in that is then saying, what can you explore in this series that maybe another writer hasn't, or what interests you about the series or the characters that you can push on a little bit. And so when I got to write my first Clancy one, which was Target Acquired, I kind of pitched to Tom Colgan. I said, there's so many iconic characters in this universe that I feel a lot of times when they come on stage, it's like the difference between an Iron Man movie and an Avengers movie. So the Iron Man, you get to do a deep dive right into Robert Downey Jr.'s character. When in the Avengers are there, you lose some of that. And so what I said is, I want to really just focus and neck it down and focus just on Jack Ryan Jr. And so as I did that with Target Acquired, it allowed me to think some more about what drives him. What are the things that he's worried about? What are the things that and I started thinking about, what's it like? I think every son looks at their father and says, am I ever going to live up to that? Am I ever going to be as good a dad as my dad was? Well, when your dad is Jack Ryan Sr., that kind of takes things to a whole nother level. And so I really wanted to push on those things. And then with Zero Hour, a little bit more, I wanted to show, Jack Ryan Jr. as a character is the only one who doesn't belong, from the perspective of he's the only one. John Clark was a Navy SEAL, Bing Chavez was a light infantryman. And then you got this guy who's only there because his last name is Ryan originally. And I thought, if that was me, I'd have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder. And so what I wanted to show more in 0 Hours, what does that look like when the guy who was the Padawan learner at the beginning finally gets to the point, he says, I've earned my spurs. I ought to be able to helm an operation now. How does that play out? And what does that look like? And so that's what really I've tried to do, is say, what about this series is interesting and kind of unexplored territory that I can push on a little bit. And that's what really drove a lot of the themes in 0 Hour.
Don, did you feel like you had to, other than those kinds of themes, did you feel like you had to change your style?
Yeah, it's so part of the thing that makes it easier for me, and this is a little bit of writer inside baseball, is that Matt is a first person point of view protagonist. And so he uses I because he's the one who's telling the story. And Jack Ryan Jr. is third person. So it feels a little bit like I'm cleansing my palate when I go from one to the other, because they feel very differently in the narrative. Now, what I will say is, when I was trying to still figure out Jack Ryan's head, it's very useful for me that Tom Colgan edits my both series of books. So Hostile Intent, my last Matt Drake book, he was the editor for, and he was the editor for 0 Hour. And he really serves as guardrails for the series and to make sure you're not, cross-pollinate. I have a great friend who's a Golden Glove boxer, and he told me once that the purpose of a referee in a fight is so that you never have to worry about hurting your opponent. He's like, you can fight as hard as you can, and you never have to worry about, are you going to hurt the guy? Because that's the ref's job, is to make sure you don't hurt the other person. And so I feel like Tom Colgan does a great job from that perspective, is I can push the envelope as far as I want, because I know he's going to be the guardrail and pull me back in. And for Target Acquired, there were a couple times where Jack Ryan Jr. maybe got a little bit too lippy, and he'd say, "That is Matt Drake talking. That is not Jack Ryan Jr. Take that out." And so you get a little bit better for that, where you get kind of a feel for what makes the characters different, and it gets a little easier each time. But I can't say enough good things about Tom as an editor, and then having him kind of riding helm on both series like that.
Cool.
So what is it from when you were crafting this tale? So you have a CIA handler, case officer, and her husband, and you could have done a whole bunch of different things with that. Like, why Iran? What was it about Iran that you decided had enough weight for an entire novel?
Well, I wanted, as I talked about, I wanted it to be based on real world events. For whatever reason, that was just important to me. I think I like to read books when they're based on real world events. And two things. One, I spent a lot of my career looking at Iran, candidly, right? And it was just a focus. It was a focus then. It's a focus now. This conflict's been boiling for a very long time. I'm somebody with a naval background, and so the idea of blocking the Straits of Hormuz and, sort of the sea lanes of communication and keeping oil flowing around the world, all those kinds of things. Iran's always just been kind of front and center to me. And then one of the things that really piqued my interest was something that's become public is Stuxnet, which was a virus that the CIA and Mossad did together in 2012 to slow down centrifuge arrays from 100,000 RPMs to 80,000 RPMs, which messed up uranium enrichment. So as I mentioned, when that plane went down, and at the time, there was talk about, are we sanctioning Iran? Are we going to get back into the JCPOA agreement between, with the IAEA? And you had the Trump administration kind of ratcheting up the pressure. We had just assassinated Soleimani. So I felt like there's this huge shadow war going on here, which for an espionage novel, of course, that's what you want, right? And I wasn't, I'm not good or mature enough to take on a Rip Rawlings, Mark Greaney, Red Metal, Red Storm Rising kind of thing. It was just too much, right? So I really wanted that shadow war kind of effect, so you could highlight people in the background, but for people to believe it and say, hey, there you go. 40 years ago, that would have been a shadow war with the Soviets. But today we've got this shadow war with Iran. So that's why I chose it.
So, it was interesting reading your books. Go ahead, Don.
Go ahead, Barbara. Go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
I'm fine. Go on.
No, the only thing I was going to say is it's really interesting. Most folks don't realize that prior to 9/11, Iran, through their Shia proxies, were responsible for more U.S. deaths than any other terrorist organization.
Yep.
So they got overshadowed a lot by the September 11th events, but they are, I think, reclaiming that role as a very dangerous adversary.
I couldn't agree more with that. And their imperial ambitions are sort of different in that they're putting up states within states, and that's effectively what Hezbollah is. And you're referring back to the 83, the bombing the Marines barracks, and also the U.S. Embassy, killing hundreds. And Bob Barris, now kind of a famous CIA officer, wrote about that quite a bit. And his nonfiction book made quite an impression on me as to how hard the CIA was battling IRGC and Quds officers all over the world. And that certainly came to a head when I was writing this book with the Soleimani thing.
Yeah.
The reason I keep butting in, Don, is you're slightly frozen and I can't tell if you're going to talk. And so I feel like we stopped and I have to say something, and there you are. So I really apologize. I didn't mean to do that. But let me wind up our part of this talk before we call Patrick up by saying it was interesting reading your books back to back. What I realized is that Mike, because this is a debut, is basically engaged in world building. He has to create this world he's going to be writing about and the characters and the whole bit. your challenge, in fact, is that you have to step into a world that was already created, and not just by Tom Clancy, but by Grant and
Mhm.
Mark and Mike and so
Mhm.
forth. And so, that legacy thing is a different challenge than creating it. So something you might be interested in knowing, I've been thinking about this a lot. So I have persuaded your mutual publisher to let me do a legacy event. So we're going to have Mike Madden with his very first Clive Cussler, and Mike Lupica with his very first, is it Spencer? Yeah, I think it is. Anyway, they are both in legacy publishing. So they're going to come together on September 6th.
That's awesome.
And I mean, it seems at first glance, really, we're going to have Parker and we're going to have, Cussler. But the point is to
Mhm.
talk about the challenges of, writing in
Mhm.
somebody else's world and how to take that forward. And, Ace and I have done a number of conversations, well, 10 actually, about the Spencers. And, you're right that
Mhm.
the only way to do it is to step into that world, but then move it forward
Mhm.
in as the world changes and according to your own style and so forth. So,
Mhm.
it's also kind of a writing school. You're writing your own books with Matt,
Mhm.
but you get to learn a lot stepping into the
Mhm.
Clancy universe. And anyway, I think it'll be a great event. So Mike, if you're
No,
interested
it
in that,
sounds awesome.
that we stream all our live events, so you'll get to watch it anyway. Why don't we call Patrick up and see what Patrick has to say, or fans have to say?
Well, our friend Ann Wilson is tuning in, and Don and I had a nice
Mm.
dinner with her
I
a
am.
couple months ago. Yeah, great lady. Let's
Mhm.
see here. The only real questions that are coming in is Jane would like to know, what does 2023 hold for your characters?
I'll go.
Well, I can go first.
Go,
Sorry,
Don.
Mike. I'm causing all kinds of problems here. I just turned in the fourth book in my Matt Drake series. It's called Forgotten War, and it is set in Afghanistan, and it's set during the fall of Afghanistan last summer. Because like most, I think, veterans of Afghanistan, what happened there and watching it kind of crumble was deeply personal to me. And I wanted to, as writers do, wanted to figure out a way to express that and express what I was getting from all my other veteran friends, which was some variation of the question, was it worth it, asked in many different ways and from many different perspectives. And so you'll see that. And what you'll also see, I've gotten a lot of comments from readers about how much they love the character Frodo, but because he was hurt, they never got to see he and Matt in the beginning. And so I talked to Tom Colgan about that, because originally I was thinking for the fourth book I'd write a prequel, and he's like, you should read Mark Graney's Sierra 6, where he has two timelines going on at the same time. So I am no Mark Graney, but what you'll see in Forgotten War is it taking place in Afghanistan present time, and also it taking place 10 years earlier during Matt and Frodo's first tour together. So that's coming out. And then my next Clancy book will also come out, and I started that today. So I have no idea what that's going to be about yet, but it will happen next year as well.
And for me, I have a book due in 3 weeks. That's the second book in the series with John and Meredith. It's called Scorched Earth, and it takes place largely in Beirut, and is really meant to highlight the differing worldviews, the divergent worldviews over Iran and Hezbollah that a political U.S. might have versus a much more, let's say, mission-directed Israel and Mossad. And so it's kind of the CIA and Mossad in competition over an issue that crops up with Hezbollah. It's called Scorched Earth, and it should launch in May of 2023.
Anything else, Patrick?
It's really about it, guys. No other questions that I can see here.
Well, I have a final I have a question for Don, which I'm very taken with the Russian doctor. And I thought, you know, with what's going on at the moment, I know you wrote the book before the Russian-Ukraine war broke out, but I thought that her dilemma and her final choice, which is really interesting, was reflects anyway what must be going on in real time, very much so in that particular combat. And I thought you did that with great sensitivity.
I appreciate you saying that. You know, it's today I'm on vacation. We were talking about that before in the Outer Banks, and I went to go get a coffee, and the barista had an accent, and I thought it might have been German or Scandinavian or something. And she was a young girl, blonde, probably in her mid-20s. And I said, "Hey, where are you from?" And she looked at me and she said, "I'm Russian." And then she walked away. And it's you know, we see the horrible things that are being done, certainly by Putin and by people he's commanding. But I think we don't spend enough time, or the brave Russian people who are protesting right now, who don't agree with what's going on and who are risking their lives to kind of show that. And so the character you're referencing is a doctor who specializes in treating patients with radiation sickness, who has a very tough choice to make. And her, you know, her choice kind of pits her humanity, her oath as a doctor against what the sensible thing would be to do that wouldn't be any risk to her. And I think there are more people making that choice than we realize right now. And I wanted to try and show that. So thank you for saying that, Barbara.
There was I disagree most of the time with all the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. I subscribe to it for the arts coverage, but I also subscribe to the New York Times and the Arizona Republic and the Washington Post. So there we are. But there was a really very good piece analyzing what's going on. And I agree with him. And I've said it from the beginning that basically this war is Putin's way to stay in power. What we were talking about earlier. So he gets to die in office with this, you know, and when you think about the human cost of that, you know, the terrible things that are happening to people to satisfy one man, it just, you know, it makes you feel like someplace, you know, there ought to be somebody out there in the cosmos that, you know, will just take him out. Why isn't one of your heroes in Moscow is what I want to know. You know, come on, guys. What we need is some guy, some Marvel superhero, you know, to go there. But, you know, it's truly an awful thing to think about the terrible price that people are paying to satisfy one person's ego. And, you know, I've always was grateful that I was born in 1940 and therefore didn't really have to live through the 1930s and the Second World War. And I find it so ironic that here I am living through it all over again. You know, because that's what's going on. And if anybody really looks at history and they look at Munich and Chamberlain and the whole bit, you know, this is not the time to back down and let Putin get away with this because, you know, it didn't work with Hitler. It's not going to work with him either. So I think your books are important statements, but I thought your Russian doctor particularly highlighted, you know, that thing. So excellent book, both of you. Thank you so much. I forgot to say that actually both authors have signed their books for us, but since Don's on vacation and Mike is new to this and we sort of messed up his address, they aren't here yet, but they're coming. So within, by the end of next week, we should have our autographed copies of Tom Clancy Zero Hour from Don. And we should have Mike's books, if we remember. Did we send you labels for them already?
Yeah, I got them. They're on their, they'll be on
So
their way back tomorrow
Mike in theory will ship his books tomorrow. And so next week, you will be able to get your autographed copies of this book and The Handler. And remember, it's always a good idea to buy a first novel, especially one that we recommend, because you'll never get another chance to be here at the start of a career. And if I went through a litany, Patrick and I could do it, of the number of authors who have come to the Poison Pen, and there have been like 2 people there. And this actually happened. And then the book is, you know, Crawdads, or the book is Don Winslow's first book, or whatever.
Connolly.
And you think, you know, why why wasn't I there? This is your chance, right, Patrick?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Actually, I have one little final question for both you guys, which is, in your books, do you ever put in private little moments or private references to people that you've served with that the public would never pick up on? I'm seeing nodding.
Well, yeah,
Ye-
I,
Yes, I'm afraid to. I knew it. I knew it. As soon as I
Yeah.
answered, I'd talk over top of Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
I know. I thought I'll just jump in because Don's going to be slow out of the blocks. But yes, I certainly did. But for me, it's a little less like I'm going to have this character and he's going to be just like this guy I know in real life, as much as it is pieces of people. So idiosyncrasies and little references and even some sayings or things like that. A little bit of dialogue here and there that to me, actually happened and are sort of my own little private joke.
Yeah, for me, like I said, Korea was my first assignment as a lieutenant, and so I was very young, very new pilot, very new leader, and so I had so many great mentors who were pilots who took me under their wings, who I flew with, who taught me how to be a platoon leader, and I used most of their names. I asked them if I could, and so most of them are actually characters in the book. The thing I like doing even more than that is taking my friends who served in one branch of special operations and putting them in the other. So for instance, there's a Navy SEAL in Zero Hour whose name is Brandon Cates, and he was actually an Army Ranger, and he hates the fact that I made him a Navy SEAL. And so those are the fun tricks you get to play when you're a writer.
I love that. I told you to go to shore and not to do this from the Outer Banks, didn't I? Because I knew this was going to happen, that we were going to have this delayed. I've been there before with another author. So anyway, we did pretty well not talking entirely over each other. It's really been a pleasure to meet you, Mike. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Barb. It's been great to be here.
Well, I've loved it. And Don, always a pleasure, dear. So I'm sure we'll get to see both of you happily in 2023. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming tonight. We appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night. Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.